Hi there, my name's Jason. I'm an amateur macro, landscape, and astrophotographer located just outside of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And this here is my first YouTube tutorial video or how-to video specifically regarding macro photography. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I shared this photo online. Now, at a glance, it looks like a couple of ice cubes placed on top of either a silver tray or a silver platter of some sort. In actuality, this is two individual grains of table salt that were photographed with a very specialized lens and then edited using a technique called focus stacking. So today I wanted to go through the process that I used to capture these images, the equipment I used, and then of course the editing technique to pull it all together. Now, before I proceed, I just want to make mention of a certain photographer, and his name is Don Komarechka. Don's a fellow Canadian. I have yet to meet Don, but I've been fortunate enough to do an online one-on-one session with Don where we talked about macro photography and specifically capturing images of snowflakes, which is an incredibly technical, incredibly challenging thing to do. Now, Don is a specialist in macro photography, and I just would encourage anyone that hasn't heard of him to go check him out. I'm going to put a link in the description to his website, as well as a couple of links to some of the YouTube videos that he's been in, where he talks about not only capturing images like this, but also the process that I'm going to show you later to edit these images. And without him, I wouldn't have been able to do this. So again, I just want to give credit where it's due. So the first thing I want to talk about is the equipment that I used, and I'm going to go through things fairly quickly. Again, I'm an amateur, so I won't give an overly technical explanation of some of the stuff, but again, I want to talk about the things that I use. So the first thing I'll make mention of is the camera itself. I'm shooting with a Canon EOS R. It's a full-frame mirrorless camera, 30 megapixel camera, and it's fantastic. I use it for everything, for my macro, landscape, and astrophotography, and that thing has never let me down. It's a great camera. And next I'll talk about the lens. This is the Canon MPE 65. Now, it's a dedicated macro lens. It's not good for anything else outside of macro. The reason for that is that its useful focusing range is about that right there. A few centimeters off the end of the lens, up to about 10 centimeters out, I believe. It will not achieve infinity focus. So again, it's very much a single purpose lens. Now, it starts at a 1:1 magnification, which is what you typically hear of when you are looking at dedicated macro lenses. But by turning this ring right here, I can go all the way up to a 5:1 magnification, all within the same lens. So that makes it very unique. Now, at the 5:1 magnification that I used for this image, the resulting depth of field is razor thin. It's impossible to get a picture of even something as small as a grain of salt in focus from front to back in a single shot. That's where focus stacking comes into play. So I like to best describe it as focus slices. So by using a lens like this, I can take individual images, moving that focal plane through the subject until I have enough images to get it in focus from front to back. I take all those images into a post-processing software, something like Photoshop, and blend them together where it preserves the sharpest points of every image, creating a final image that is in focus from front to back. I hope that describes it as best as I can anyways, but I'm going to demonstrate for you the technique of capturing the images and then editing them. Next, I'm going to show you the focusing rail. So I talked about moving the focal plane through that subject. This is one of the tools that you can use for doing that. So the way this works is you mount this to the top of your tripod, you mount your camera and lens to the top of the focusing rail, and then by turning this small wheel here on the side, I can move the camera forward and backwards, closer to or further from that subject, moving that focal plane through the subject, capturing images along the way. So not completely mandatory, but it is possible to do this handheld, but in a kind of a studio environment like what I have here, where I can control all the conditions, something like this is an ideal way to do it. Next, I will talk about a remote trigger. So when dealing with magnifications like this, any type of camera shake will introduce a lot of motion blur. So you want a way to trigger the shutter without actually touching the camera. So you can use a wired trigger release if that's what you have. I happen to use a wireless one. This one's called the Myops trigger. Failing that, if you don't have either, that's okay. there's a 2-second timer built into just about every camera nowadays. So you can set it, you press that shutter down, hands off for the 2 seconds before it fires the shutter, and that gives it enough time for the camera to stabilize, to minimize any type of camera shake. So that's a critical thing as well. The next thing I'll talk about is how to light this particular subject. So I use external flashes. There's a couple different ways though. You can illuminate your subject using continuous lighting, something like a very, very bright LED flashlight. I used, in this particular case, an external flash. This is one by a company called Yongnuo. No particular reason. I try both quite often. I'll try the flashlight, I'll try the external flash. So much of this is experimentation and just trying different things out until you get the desired look that you're going for. And in this case here, an external flash did the trick for me. So I have a wireless trigger, an external flash that I positioned a certain way to give me the quality that I was looking for. And then lastly, a tripod. Any sturdy tripod will do. In my case, I happen to use one that has a geared tripod head. Now that's not mandatory by any stretch, but when you're trying to compose an image, especially at a 5:1 magnification, your movements are really exaggerated. A geared tripod head allows you to make very fine movements in all the different axes. So I can pan, I can move it up and down, I can tilt, and that in combination with the focusing rail, which allows me forward and backwards movement in very fine increments, composing your image is so much easier. So again, once I have all this set up, I'll demonstrate for you why I think it's such a good tool. The next thing, or I guess the last thing really, is the subject matter itself. So I have a small bowl here with some table salt, a pair of tweezers to handle the very difficult to handle table salt, and then I needed a surface to shoot this on. So this is a small LED flashlight. Now, actually, before I go on, I'll mention, when I was composing this image, I tried a couple different things. I tried a mirror, I tried the screen of a tablet, and both were okay, but they didn't quite give me the look that I was going for. In the end, this did. And I didn't use it for any form of illumination at all. What I liked about it was just the reflective qualities of the lens itself at the top of the flashlight. So what I did is I placed this on my desk, standing on its end. I placed the 2 grains of salt on the top of the lens. My camera was positioned at an angle about like this. The flash was on the opposite side, creating some backlighting. And my theory was, depending on the angle that the light entered into this flashlight head, some of it would bounce around on the reflective surfaces inside, almost creating this bottom lighting effect. And in the end, I really, really like how it turned out. So getting back to what I said earlier about experimentation, just try different things, and you'll be surprised at what you can create. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put everything back together again. I'm going to set this shot up again, and I will walk you through the steps of actually capturing the individual images. We'll then take them into Lightroom and Photoshop, and I will demonstrate the focus stacking technique. So I will see you in a few. Okay, so welcome back. Now, before I start taking the images, I thought I would quickly go over the setup. So here I have the macro focusing rail. It's connected to my geared tripod head, and it's these 3 adjustment knobs here that make this such a joy to use. That allows me really fine control over the yaw, the tilt, and the pitch of the camera and lens. And that in combination with the fine movement of the macro focusing rail makes composing an image like this so much easier, especially at a 5:1 magnification. So I have my Canon EOS R, the MPE65, of course, set to 5 times, a wireless flash trigger. This is my wireless shutter release. There's the MyOps. Now that connects to a smartphone app, and that's how I trigger the shutter. And then there's my flash. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the ideal position for this composition was on the opposite side of the subject, directly across from the lens, and that just gave me the effect that I was looking for. I have it sitting on top of a small bowl just to give me the height and give me the angle that I needed. Now, if I come around behind the camera, you'll see that the 2 grains of salt are framed up in the middle of the shot. Now, what I'm going to do very quickly is turn one of the knobs on the gear tripod head just so you can see. So just the slightest movement allows me to frame that subject up right in the center So again, a geared tripod head just makes this so much easier than trying to work with a typical ball head. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to connect the camera to the computer, and that will allow you to have a little bit of a better perspective as I go through the process of capturing these images. Okay, so what you're seeing here is a live view directly from my camera. And in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing a view from the side of the focusing rail. And the reason I did this was so that I could demonstrate for you what it means to make these fine adjustments using this focusing rail. Now, I'll quickly go over the settings, and you can see them on screen. I'm shooting at 1/200th of a second. That's the flash sync speed for this camera. I'm shooting wide open at f2.8 aperture, and I'm at ISO 100. Now, I quickly want to talk about that aperture. When I'm using this lens, especially at the 5:1 magnification, there's something that I need to consider, and it's called the effective aperture. So even though I have the camera set to f2.8, the effective aperture I'm getting is f16. Now, if I had the camera set to f16, the effective aperture I'd be getting then is actually f96, which is virtually unusable. So you really have to get your head around this when you're shooting with this lens. And in this case here, with this particular subject matter at 5:1 magnification, my only option really is to shoot wide open at f2.8, because in effect I'm getting f16, which is actually ideal. So the first thing I'm going to do is zoom in on the grains of salt here. And right now they're completely out of focus. So I'm going to use the wheel on the side of the focusing rail here, and I'm going to start turning it forward so that the entire camera and lens starts moving down the focusing rail towards the subject. Now, if you watch the grain of salt on the left, you'll see that it's actually starting to come into focus using these very, very fine movements. Right about there. So I've resolved some detail at the front of the left grain of salt. And what I'm going to do now that the camera has stabilized, I'm going to take an image using my remote shutter. Now, that was my first focus slice. So if I go into the replay here and zoom in, you can see that I've gotten just a little bit of the front of that left grain of salt in focus, and the right one is starting to come into focus. So if I go back, I'll zoom in again so you can see what I'm doing here. You can see how much the camera shakes just through the slightest bit of slightest touch. Now I'm going to turn this wheel on the side again to move that focal plane forward just a bit. That did it right there. I'm going to let the camera stabilize, and I'll take another image. Let's do another one here. Again, wheel on the side, ever so slight. Let's move the focal plane a little bit further forward, and I'm going to take another image. And I'm going to repeat this process, so you're starting to get the idea. I will continue to take one image after another, moving that focal plane through the subject until I get the last image, which will be the furthest point away from me, probably on that right grain of salt, because it's a little further back than the one on the left. And once I have all those images, I'm guessing somewhere between 15 to 25 of them is probably what it's going to take. I will bring them all into Adobe Lightroom, and that's what starts the editing process. So I'm not going to make you sit here and go through each one of these images. Hopefully you get the idea of how this is done. I'm going to see you in a few minutes when I've got all the images that I need. Okay, so I've finished capturing the images. Now, I had guessed between 15 to 25. In the end, it was 26 photos that were required to give me the necessary number of focus slices. Now, I'm an Adobe user. I use Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. And for something like this, I will start here in Lightroom, where I'll do some basic edits to the photos. And then I'll import them as layers into Photoshop, where the actual focus stacking takes place. Now, once I've finished showing you this technique here, I'm going to demonstrate another software. It's called HELICON Focus, and it does things a little bit differently, but it achieves great results as well. And that way it gives you a couple of options on how to do something like this. But we're going to start here in Lightroom. So across the bottom, you can see the 26 photos that I captured, and currently I have the first one selected. Now I'm going to zoom in on the left grain of salt, and you can see that the leading edge is in focus. That was our first focus slice that we captured. Now I'm going to slowly just advance through the first 4 or 5 photos here so you can see. If you keep your eye right here, you'll see that the focal plane is slowly shifting through that subject with each photo. That's the individual focus slices that I was talking about. And I'm just going to go back to the first one. So when I mentioned doing some basic edits here in Lightroom, there's a reason for that. And I've just discovered over time that with focus stacking, it's useful if you can give the software a little bit of a helping hand. And by doing that, I mean increasing the sharpness a little bit, increasing the contrast, bringing up the shadows, bringing down the highlights, just giving the software the best chance possible to be able to see those sharp areas so that it can do its work. So let's go through those edits now. I'm going to start with one of these middle images, and I'm going to explain why. If I zoom in on the top of this right grain of salt here, you can see that this is pretty much the brightest area in the entire scene. I want to make sure that I preserve detail in this area and not blow out these highlights here. If I was to start with this first image, you can see that that area is much, much darker. So the adjustments that I make on this image, which I then paste across the rest of the images, might unintentionally blow out the highlights on this one. So I start with one of these as my base image. Now I'm just going to go through the edits that I would normally do on something like this. I like to cool something like this down a little bit. That look, I think, suits it a little bit better. I'm going to raise the exposure just a touch. Going to bring down the highlights, and again, that's just going to bring out detail here. Okay. I'm going to raise the shadows, which will help to bring out detail in some of these other areas. Bring up the whites just a touch. There we go. I'm happy with that there. Now, the goal there is to make sure that the in-focus detail is nice and visible, and it just gives the software the best chance possible to pull all that detail out during the focus stacking process. Now, I also see some purple fringing here that's kind of driving me crazy, and also some green fringing. So what I'm going to do is come down here, just make a very quick adjustment there. That pretty much got rid of the purple. And the green, try to bring that down. I still see a lot of it there, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this down. There we go. That's a little more pleasing to my eye. Certainly doesn't jump out at me as much. The next thing I like to do is just improve the sharpness a little bit here. Again, in the spirit of giving that software the best chance possible. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to zoom in here on the top, and I'm going to zero these back out, the sharpening. I'm just going to kind of, to my own eye, bring some of this up here. There we go. Happy with that there. Okay, just brought some more sharpness to those areas. And then lastly, I'm going to do a little bit of a crop. Not the final crop for this image, but one that's going to bring me a little bit closer in on the detail here. My theory is I find that this just helps that focus stacking software do a little bit of a better job if I just get in a little bit closer to the detail. Something like that is fine. Okay, now I'm going to take the edits that I've done on this one image. I'm going to copy all the settings. I'm going to highlight all of the images. Then I will right click and paste the settings. Now that's made all of them exactly the same. All of the edits that I did in the one now apply to all of them. The next step is to take these images into Photoshop. So I'm going to click on the first one, hold down the Shift key, click on the last one, right click, edit in, and then open as layers in Photoshop. Now this will open up 26 individual layers, and I will be right back to show you the next steps. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. Now you can see on the bottom right hand side that all of the images have been loaded as individual layers. Now the first step we have to take is called auto-aligning the layers. Now to do that, I have the top one selected, I scroll to the bottom, hold down the Shift key, and then select the bottom one. That highlights them all. Up here under Edit, I go to Auto-Align Layers, and then I use the default settings and I say OK. Now Photoshop will go through all of the images and line them up perfectly with each other. if it has to give one of the images a slight nudge, left or right or up or down, it'll do that to make sure that they're all perfectly aligned. And that's a critical step before we move on to the next part of focus stacking. Now, there's two different ways to do it from here on. I'm going to show you how Photoshop just does on its own. We'll do that first. So all of the layers are still selected. It's now done its alignment process. I'm going to say Edit, Auto Blend Layers, Stack Images, Seamless Tones and Colors is selected. I turn off the Content Aware Fill. All that will do is it would try to fill in these corners here. I don't need it to do that. And then I'm going to say OK. Now this process will take a couple of minutes, but we'll be right back and I'll show you the result. Okay, so Photoshop has finished the focus stacking process, and this is the final outcome. Now, it looks good at first glance. There's obviously a lot more areas in focus than any one of the individual 26 photos that I took. It did a decent job, but if we scroll in, you can see that there's quite a few areas where Photoshop just missed. This is still blurry on both sides of the grains of salt, the foreground, the background. Again, it does a decent job, but it was once I had discovered Don Komarechka's techniques, I realized that there is a better way, and a way that we can bring out a lot more detail. It just takes a bit more time, but it's well worth it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly rewind here back to the point where we had just finished the auto align, and then we're going to try a bit of a different technique. Okay, so we're back at that stage where I had just finished the auto align. I have all of my layers still selected over here. Oh, I should redo that again. Sorry about that. And this is where we're going to try something different. Now, instead of proceeding with the stack, I'm going to right-click on all of the selected layers, and I'm going to duplicate those layers. So you can see it's now created a batch called Copy, and they are currently selected, and then my original ones have been deselected. Now, using this copied set, I'm going to, again, do the auto blend. And I will be right back. And now we're back to where we were before. Photoshop has finished the focus stack, and we have the same result here. On the right-hand side, the 26 copy layers are still highlighted, and then below that are the 26 original aligned layers. So what we're going to do is, with the copy layers highlighted, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to merge those layers into one. I'll then take that merged layer and drag it all the way to the bottom. And then once that's there, I'm going to turn off all the layers above it. Okay, so if I turn on this layer here, the one that's immediately above my merged layer, you'll see that the entire image goes blurry. Now the reason for that is that this layer here is one of the original focus slices that I captured. It happens to be the last image that I took. And you can tell because the very tail end of the right grain of salt is in focus. For this next step, I would prefer to have the first image that I captured immediately above my merge layer. Now to do that, I'm simply going to select all of the original focus slice layers by clicking on the top one and holding down the Shift key. That selects them all. Go to Layer at the top, Arrange, and Reverse. Now, when I click on the very first layer above my merge layer and turn it on, we can see that it's now the first image that I captured with this area in focus, and that's how I prefer to continue here. Now, this next step can be quite time consuming, so I'm going to move through it fairly quickly, but you will definitely learn enough here to get the idea of how this works. So first I'm going to select the second layer. I'm going to add a layer mask, and on the left-hand side, you can see I have my paintbrush tool selected, and I have white set as the foreground color. Now, I'm going to zoom in on this left grain of salt so you can see exactly what I'm doing. Now, by using Control-I as the keyboard shortcut on a Windows keyboard here, you can see that this essentially turns on and off that layer mask. Now, this is the Photoshop stack, and this is the original focus layer that I captured. Now, what I'm looking for is any detail that Photoshop missed from that original image. And right away, you can see that along the leading edge here, it's quite blurry on the final image, but there's some detail to be had from the original focus stack. So I'm simply going to paint that detail back in. And over here, there's a bit more. Paint that in. And up here, there's a little bit more again, and I'll paint that in. So that gives you an idea of how that works. I will then advance to the next layer, add a layer mask, and again, Control I, cycling back and forth, looking for detail that Photoshop missed. And you can see there's a bit more detail up here. So I'm going to paint that in. On this side over here, there's a little bit more there, a little bit more down here. I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. And as I'm going, I want to look over here on the right-hand side, of course, to see if any additional details coming through on this one. Now, this was a little further back, but already I see right here, yeah, there's a little bit more that I can resolve right there. Now, go back to this one, go to the next layer, add another layer mask, Control I, and I'm cycling back and forth looking for sharper detail. And sure enough, there's a bit more here that I can bring through to the Photoshopped version. You see, I'm just going to paint that in right across there. And down here, a little bit more detail over here. A little bit more detail right there. And if I happen to go too far, so I'm going to deliberately paint over this here. If I happen to make a mistake, I can just paint that back and it returns to the original layer. Okay? A little bit more there. Now I'll go over to the right one. A little bit more detail right here. Okay, you're getting the idea. I will do another layer. Just going to keep jumping ahead as quick as I can just to give you a few examples. So here's my Photoshop version. Here's my original layer, and you can see there's quite a bit of nice sharp detail here, and there's some blurriness here, so I can just paint that right in. Over here, there's quite a bit of sharpness on my original layer that didn't quite make it to the final one, so I can paint that in. All the while, I'm improving the overall sharpness of the final copy. Right here, definitely some sharpness along there. Up here. And you know what, after a while, it becomes muscle memory, the going back and forth with the Control I on the keyboard. Okay, and I'm just going to go over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on doing this. I'm not going to make you sit here as I go through this entire process. I will come back a little bit further through this edit because there's some other things I want to show you. Okay, so I decided to stop about here. I have roughly 9 layers left to go, but I thought this would be a good time to deal with the foreground. Now, just like the grains of salt, Photoshop struggles in certain situations, and this foreground here, it didn't do the best job. You can see in here, there's some areas in focus, some that are blurry, and it just, I mean, it tries, but there's areas that it misses. So what I like to do when it comes to the foreground, I like to pick one layer specifically, and I will use only that layer to create my foreground. Now this layer happens to give me the effect that I'm looking for. So I'm going to use that Control I to toggle back and forth, and you can see what I mean. Now I could go for a layer that would give me a sharp edge around the reflections of the grains of salt, but I actually like this one where it's softened a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the size of the brush a little bit here, and I'm just going to first bring through the softness just around the edges of the reflections of the grains of salt, just up to the edge there, because I have to be somewhat careful here. I'm going to smooth over these areas that are just beyond the sharpened areas in the middle, because I like the effect that this has here. So I'm just going to soften up the edges here. Going to be careful to come up the middle, bring all this out here, okay? And on the other side, I'm just going to carefully come in to about there. Go all the way around. Okay. Just soften this up here a little bit. There you go. Okay. Now, once I have that, I can actually zoom out a bit. I can increase the size of the brush because now I don't have to be as careful. Now I can make larger strokes here, and I can do larger areas at a time. Now I'm going to come up to about the halfway point, right about here. Okay. And then do the same on the other side, come up to about the halfway point of the image. Smooth this out on that side. And then I can take larger strokes across the bottom just to smooth it all out. So now that's essentially one entire, it's pulled from one entire layer. There we go. And you can see over here in the layer mask, all the area that I've now brought through. And that takes care of my foreground. I really like that. Everything is softened all around the edges, but I still have preserved a bit of sharpness in the reflection here of the grains of salt. Just an effect that I like. Now, I'm going to continue on the next few layers, and I'm going to bring you back when I'm dealing with the background. Okay, so I've advanced a little bit further ahead. We've gone a couple more layers, and I'm now going to use this one to create my background layer, similar to what I did with my foreground layer. Now, I have my brush selected here. I'm going to start a little bit smaller. And again, now I'm going to stay above the halfway point of this image because I've already taken care of the foreground. And now I'm just going to, again, just use a smaller brush so I can get somewhat close to this grain of salt here. This allows me to come down through the middle. I don't want to get too close because it'll start to reintroduce some blurry areas from the grains of salt potentially. So just the purpose of this is just to smooth things out immediately around the grains of salt here. Okay, now I'll zoom out. I'm going to increase the size of the brush, and now I can do the broader brush strokes where I don't have to be as careful, but I'm staying above the halfway point. And this is just going to smooth out that background. You don't see as much of the issue here at the top, but again, just nitpicking a little bit here. Okay, and there you go. So that's now the background. Okay, now I have, I believe, a few more layers to complete. I'll go through them and then we will finish this off. So I've gone through the remaining layers and this is the final result. Now you can see that I managed to preserve a lot more detail in both of the grains of salt, much more than what I originally started out with. And the foreground and the background are nice and smooth. So compared to the single pass process that I did when we first started, this is a much more pleasing result to my eye. And if you're willing to take the time and go through a technique like this, I think you can get some great results. Now, not quite finished yet. On either side of the grains of salt, you can see there's quite a bit of debris here. That's dust specks. And at a 5:1 magnification, it's nearly impossible to avoid them. Now, these other scratches here, I expected those. This surface is plastic, and there's quite a few scuff marks and scratches on them, and I actually don't mind the look of that, but the dust specks have to go. So with the snap of a finger, I'm going to remove them. And that looks a lot better to me. Now, I've removed the dust, but I've left all this nice texturing that's a result of the scratches and scuffs that are on that surface. I actually really like the look of that. So now I'm going to crop this image down to something like this here. There we go. Like that. And I'm going to apply some adjustments as far as color, saturation, and contrast. And the final result will look like this. And there you go. So I hope you like this photo. Now, at the beginning of the video, I promised you that I would go over an alternative to Photoshop, another tool that you can use for focus stacking. And there is a program called HELICON Focus. Now, that's this program here. Now, I've imported the original 26 images into this program, and just using the default settings, which is what I typically do, there's 3 different rendering methods that this program will use to try to create a stacked image. I'm just going to go through each one of the 3. This is what I typically would do. So I'll render it using the first option. And one thing you'll notice that this program has on its side is speed. It's already completed the first render. Now, when I zoom in, I have the same artifacts though that I have in Photoshop. In some respects, it's done a better job, but in other areas, it's created some pretty interesting anomalies here. Now, I'm going to try the second method, which is just using a different process. Let's look at this one. Again, some pretty funky artifacts around here and over the top of the grains of salt as well. Let's try the third one. It's rather interesting how this one works. And I'll look in on this one, and again, Yeah, quite a bit of noise here around there, and of course over the top as well. So out of the three, I would say that the first one probably gave me the best result to start with. Now there's a retouching tab up here, and the way this one works is that you'll notice that there's a side on the left and there's a side on the right. Now, if I hover over an area on the right that I want to improve the focus on and hold down the F9 key, you'll see that on the left, it's grabbed that layer. Now, if I go over here, it's grabbing another layer, and you can see that as I move around, it's actually picking the layer that refers to that area of the subject. From a speed standpoint, it's fantastic, and compared to having to go through Photoshop and find the layer and touch it up that way, this is far, far quicker. I have found, however, that this program struggles with the alignment step. It doesn't always get it right. Certain subjects it does very, very well. Other ones it just fails miserably. And Photoshop tends to do a better job from that perspective. So I'll try both just to see which one gives me the better starting point. But you might want to check out this one. Again, HELICON Focus, and see if it's something that you might like to use. Okay, so that's how I created this image. Now, I hope you liked the video and that you picked up some tips and tricks that you can use in your own macro experiments. If you have any questions at all, or even better yet, if you have any suggestions on things that I could maybe have tried differently, please leave a comment below. Now, I will also leave a link to Don Komarechka's website as promised. Please check out his work. Check out the YouTube videos that he's been in. Like I said, so much of what I learned has come from him, and he's fantastic. If you liked what you see here, please like and subscribe. I plan on doing more of these, not only about macro photography, but I plan on doing some for landscape and eventually astrophotography once I really fully get my head around that. I'm still learning a lot there too. So thank you so much for stopping by, and I will see you soon.